Welcome, everyone, to today's episode of the Rogue Thoughts podcast. And today, our guest is Dr. Ellis, a leading expert on Latin America and transnational crimes at the U.S. Army War College. He's advised U.S. officials and studied how criminal networks move by sea and land. He's published 5 books on this topic and has served as the Secretary of State for Policy Planning on the staff with the responsibility of Latin America, the Caribbean, as well as international narcotics and law enforcement. Welcome, Dr. Ellis.
It's a pleasure to be with you on the program.
Thank you. So, the news has blown up about this. What do you really think is going on in Venezuela? Is it about regime change? Is it about narcotics? Or is there something that we're all missing here?
It's a great question. And I think the important thing is that it's okay to understand that it's about a lot of different things at the same time. So, number one, you have emphasis by President Trump, especially since he came back into office the second time, with respect to things that are happening that directly affect Americans, especially his core base. And certainly from the election, an emphasis has been in the damage that drugs are doing. And so, number one, the fact that you have a focus on Mexico as a source of fentanyl and working with President Sheinbaum there. Certainly a focus on Cartel de los Soles with Nicolas Maduro as a leader, of that really criminal franchise that's transformed and hijacked, Venezuela, as well as pressure in other areas. And so I think on the one hand, you do legitimately see this tactic of deploying a significant amount of force into the Caribbean, the amphibious Ready Group and the 22nd MEF, now the Forward Carrier Battle Group, et cetera, with the symbolic purpose of acting against and deterring drugs, not only in the Caribbean, but certainly in the Pacific as well. But number two, I think there's long been a recognition of specifically the Maduro regime as a thorn in the side of the Trump administration. Now, the focus in the first administration was on democracy, investing heavily in trying then to help the legitimate government of Juan Guaido retake power. President Trump left office, of course, in January 2021, unsuccessful in that endeavor. Now, essentially, he's back, and Maduro continues to be a thorn in the side with respect to drugs, with respect to immigration, with respect to a lot of other things, hosting Russia, China, Iran. And so other people who advise and support President Trump's decision-making, certainly Secretary of State and head of the National Security Council, Marco Rubio, think about these things. And so I think what you really have is a confluence of things. It is the focus to stop the flow of drugs and other harms to the U.S., which is a core political issue, and it's essentially to put an end to the Maduro administration threatening the United States. Now, the restoration of a legitimate democratic regime, certainly Edmundo Gonzalez was elected by over 2/3 of Venezuelans, as proven by voting tallies from voting rolls, July 28th, 2024. And certainly, I think by people such as Secretary Rubio, that would be seen as a victory, but it's not necessarily about regime change. It's about essentially stopping a threat that's been coming out of Venezuela in multiple dimensions for quite some time. So that could result in a big deal. It could result in Maduro departing office. Without a democratic transition, it could result in something else. I think that is undefined, and that's important to understand why President Trump, has kind of equivocated, has gone back and forth as saying, well, maybe I'm not really going for land strikes. I'm certainly not going for regime change. And yet regime change is a possible logical consequence of the type of action that I think is being contemplated, to not put too fine of a point on things.
You mentioned multiple threats out of Venezuela. What are those multiple threats?
Well, I mean, to start with, as we mentioned before, you have essentially first under Hugo Chavez and then under Nicolas Maduro, the transformation of Venezuela into basically a criminal franchise. And that's not just the drugs, but it's also illegal mining activities, extortion activities, et cetera. Venezuela has become a refuge for groups like the ELN and others. And so you have essentially the criminality which affects the United States mostly through drugs. So that's one threat. Number two certainly is the displacement of 8 million Venezuelans as affecting the region and certainly as affecting the United States. You saw, for example, the way in which a specific prison gang, Tren de Aragua, basically preying on desperate Venezuelans as they came in first into Colombia and Peru and into the United States, that their turf fights exploiting those Venezuelans brought a lot of violence to U.S. cities, which I think was a big shock for us back in 2024 during that campaign season. But certainly beyond that, as I indicated before, it's really turning Venezuela into the principal country hosting extra-hemispheric U.S. adversaries. Certainly China, and China's done a lot of military engagement as well as just the economic engagement in the oil and in mining and in other sectors. China has sold Venezuela its system for basically doing electronic social control, what it calls the fatherland identification card, but other things, camera systems tied to biometrics with facial recognition, etc. China has sold Venezuela fighter aircraft. It's sold Venezuela radars and various other things. It's launched space vehicles, and it has access to space assets in Venezuela, to tracking stations, again, through the cooperation of the regime. So you have the hosting of Chinese threats. You have the hosting of Russian threats. It was only last year that you had Venezuela hosting the Russian missile frigate Admiral Gorshkov when it and the nuclear submarine Kazan came down to the region, again showing that they could project power. Russia time and time again has come into Venezuela, literally just last week, brought in a plane load of air defense systems, Bukemi 2s, I believe, and possible Panzer S-1 air defense systems on top of the S-300 longer range defense systems that they provided. Russia has brought in Wagner troops. They have collaborated in various different ways in exercises, usually on an annual basis, etc. And Iran, frankly. Also, Venezuela has become the primary host for Iran's access to the hemisphere, not just working in exchange for Venezuelan gold laundered through Turkey to be able to keep the Venezuelan refineries up and running, but also collaboration on weapons production. So you have the Mojahir 6 and other drones being put together by Iran and Venezuela's Kavim military industry complex collaboratively. You have some possible work on missile collaboration in the same area in the Paraguayan Peninsula. You have the possibility, you have certainly the purchase of Iranian fast boats, maybe some training done in Bandar Abbas of Venezuelan Naval Special Forces that could allow those Iran-trained special forces to maybe do things against oil platforms. You had the hosting of Quds forces in Venezuela and the use of the reflagged Venezuelan airline, now known as Sur, used to bring Iranian and Hezbollah operatives around the region. So the list goes on, but although there are other countries that are problematic, when you really look at what is the country in the region that has arguably created the most problems in terms of drugs and criminality and migration in China, in Russia, in Iran, in Hezbollah, it is the Nicolas Maduro regime. And so I think there's a certain very logical, as the Trump administration focuses on the Americas and things that are directly threatening U.S. equities, I think rightfully attention is front and center on the Maduro regime and in Venezuela.
So, with that said, is Venezuela the, I guess, next place for a proxy war between U.S. and China and Russia? Could it be like a Ukraine now, or is that too early to determine that?
So I would say that certainly it's not a proxy war, and again it depends on how we understand a proxy war. But if we go back to the Cold War and we think about the U.S. versus the Soviet Union, in which you had a Soviet Union that was actively trying to use subversion, support for guerrilla forces to overthrow governments, or reciprocally in cases like Nicaragua, where you had a Soviet-backed government and the U.S. supporting guerrillas such as the Contras out of Honduras to try to again overthrow that communist regime. So when we think of proxy war, at least in the traditional sense, we're talking about the use of military forces, guerrilla forces, subversion to change government, usually in military and espionage ways. To me, that really isn't what's going on with China. I mean, there is, for me, the nature of China's competition in the Americas and elsewhere. It's first and foremost about China getting what it wants in terms of access to raw materials, access to markets, dominating key technology sectors, but also reshaping the global institutions for a world that's more amenable to China, doing certain things in the digital space to get access to data about foreign government decision making, about commercial intellectual property and things like that. It's about China using what they call people-to-people relationships again on the light side to be able to influence what people say or don't say critically about China, or recognizing China over Taiwan. In some cases, you see indications that those people-to-people relationships could actually be used for information providing, espionage, other things, and in time of war, that commercial presence without it necessarily being a overt military basing agreement or anti-U.S. alliance. That commercial presence could be used by state-owned companies like Costco to be able to act against the U.S. So having said that, you say, well, is there a proxy war with the U.S. and China going on in Venezuela? What I would say is really no. I mean, certainly to the degree the question is, to what degree is Venezuela open as a place where China can operate in the tech space, in the military space, and in other spaces, or do you have a democratic rule of law regime which still does business with China, but does business with China in ways in which everybody's on a equal playing field, and there are not these kind of non-transparent predatory deals which in my judgment affect both U.S. security interests as well as U.S. equities in time of war, but also U.S. influence in the region. So I think to that extent, the kind of struggle for influence in commerce and space and military is going on across the region. Venezuela is only one flavor of that, but I think certainly whatever happens in Venezuela, China as a key actor in Venezuela for quite some time, that Venezuela will be one of those battlegrounds in which that influence and strategic positioning occurs, in my opinion.
So this conflict got, I guess, more publicized when those boats, those Colombian fishermen boats, were shot missiles at. Before that, the policy of the U.S., from my understanding, was to board those boats and, question those people, take evidence, see what ledgers or drugs are there. How do you think the transition from that to blowing the boats up has gone, and is that more effective than the previous policy?
It's a great question, and I think it has to be answered at multiple levels. Number one, in many ways, strategic dynamics, perception is as important, if not more important, than reality. And so clearly, with many countries in the region, there is a strong questioning of the legality of this, so whether these are extrajudicial killings, et cetera, whether these are legal under international law. I believe with the UN, Kirk Volker, the human rights head, is strongly questioned whether there is whether this is legal. But whatever the reality, the perception that the U.S. is acting in a way that's outside the law or excessively aggressive, that does impact a lot of allies. That impacts, as a matter of fact, there has been a suspension both of Colombia, which wasn't entirely surprising, but also of British intel sharing, largely because they don't want to be blamed for that. There was the issue of our very close friend, the Dominican Republic, with the Luis Abinader government, deciding that they did not want to host the Summit of the Americas this year. And I suspect it was because Abinader did not, they referred to differences in the region. This was not a time for common ground. But I suspect that Abinader did not want to, being a friend of the United States, being a friend of President Trump, did not want on his watch the Dominican Republic becoming just a source of a major fight between radical leftist leaders such as Gustavo Petro or Lula da Silva and others over U.S. actions in the Caribbean. And so because of the perceptions, there have been effects. One can say that there are effects that have to do with also China or Russia. So it's difficult when I think we in the U.S. rightfully call out China's aggression. It's really beyond the legal framework. Maritime claims in the South and East China Sea. It's illegal building of islands there. It's internment of Uyghur Muslims. And so when there's a perception of the U.S. as doing things out of true power, whether it's true or not, it undermines our ability strategically, globally, to call out China or even to call out Russia for, what would be the enormous number of people that have died because of Russia's, flagrant, invasion and continued activities in Ukraine. Now, from a drug standpoint, you're absolutely correct. The previous policy always was to treat this as a traditional law enforcement mission. Indeed, even when Navy boats used to be involved, there was the insistence that a Coast Guard officer or officers would be on that Navy boat, something called a law enforcement detachment or leadet, so that if a Navy boat stopped somebody on the high seas, that there was a law enforcement authority for doing so. And so now the U.S., I think, legal case, to the extent that I superficially represent it, is number one, establishing these groups within U.S. law based on intelligence finding as terrorist organizations, and also getting international allies such as Argentina and Peru and in Ecuador and in others in Paraguay to recognize them as terrorist groups as well. Then to be able to say, okay, the U.S. is acting against these drug runners as terrorists, as we have acted against terrorists in other part of the world. So that is, at least in a superficial way, through Department of Justice positions, part of the legal position. Now, not everybody buys that. Not everybody, even if they buy it, believes that it is fully a moral. But in terms of the effectiveness tactically, I think on the one hand, clearly there's been a short-term enormous deterrent effect. If you can say, well, these aren't actually the core members of the group; these are just people who are being paid to run drugs, maybe because they need the money, maybe because they've been involved in these organizations for a while in this peripheral way, but whatever the affiliation of the person, clearly there has been a dramatic fall off in transits by drug boats across the Caribbean. And there's been a dent, as a lot of those operations lately, the now 19 operations, have started taking place in the Pacific. I think there's actually been as many operations in the Pacific as there have been in the Caribbean now. And so clearly those transits are off. What I think many of us suspect is that it's not that the transits have just stopped. Some are being held back. Some are now going by land routes. Some are going by commercial cargo. Increased use of what's always been another vehicle, putting these in shipping containers. And then there's the question of often criticized. Well, most of these drugs are going to Europe. Most of these cocaine isn't the source of the number of overdose deaths in the United States. So how effective is this really? And I would say the answer there is, to the degree the U.S. is collaborating with the Mexicans, both through a combination of intel and other activities, and probably some threats and pressure to control the fentanyl that comes out of Sinaloa, in combination with strikes in the Pacific and in the Atlantic. Although a lot of the Caribbean cocaine routes go mostly to Europe, you can say that there has been some deterrent effect, some impact. Probably not on the organizations themselves so much, because, as has been widely noted, the people who actually run the drugs, although they're losing a lot of boats, but they've got a lot of money to buy new boats. But clearly, this is not going after the heads of the organizations. To the extent that you drive them underground, you may actually make it more difficult to go after the heads of the organization. Although, if you take down a big supplier like Cartel de las Olas, that's true. So I think at the end of the day, that really the answer is it's mixed. We're doing more than just blowing up drug boats without effect. There is a deterrent effect. It's not perfect. It's shifting the flows in other areas. It's not really taking down the organization, but we are doing other things in Mexico and in Venezuela. At least if we do act on the ground in Venezuela, that could make a big difference. But you're right. Are there other policies that might be more effective? Probably. Could we have the same deterrent effect in interdicting with a much smaller or different group of assets? Probably. But there is some effectiveness. But those of us who watch this closely think, this is probably about more than just the drugs.
Okay, so since you said that, that's great, because my next question was, Isn't Colombia a bigger producer of drugs overall, like specifically cocaine, more so than Venezuela? So wouldn't you want to target Colombia first instead of Venezuela?
Well, it's a great question, and it depends on what you mean by targeting. So, yeah, the three what are considered traditional major source zone countries for cocaine in the region, of course, are Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia. So, a good portion of the cocaine that's produced in Colombia does eventually go towards the United States, although some goes to Europe. Also, in Colombia, with the policies of the Petro regime, you've seen just an explosion of coca growing. In part, it was because after the flawed 2016 peace agreements, the incentives for producing more coca and eventually cocaine took off. In addition to that, the policies of Gustavo Petro, the current leader, it was really to stop aerial spraying of the plantations, to have reduced efforts by manual eradication, which is very difficult. And so really by not going after the smallholder cocoa farmers, what you saw is a increase, it's estimated from what was back in about 2016, about 40,000 hectares under cultivation to what's now about, I believe it's 260,000. So, it's increased by multiples. And of course, on top of that, the what they call the efficiency, genetic variants of to have more alkaloids per coca, ways of basically putting more plants in a given area. And so the efficiencies growing as well. And so literally in the last year, I think it was United Nations Organization for Against Drugs and Crime, UNODC, estimated that Colombian cocaine production had increased just in 1 year by 53%. So you're absolutely right. Clearly, Colombia is the major source for U.S.-bound cocaine. Now, it is also true that, especially in recent years, and groups like Insight Crime have documented this well, the amount of Venezuela, which used to be just a cocaine transit route. It used to be that Colombia, instead of sending its cocaine just across the Gulf of Urubá to the Dominican Republic or to Guatemala, Honduras, would actually try to get around some of the surveillance by sending it through Venezuela, basically into Zulia, Lake Maracaibo, and up into the Caribbean that way. And then, of course, as European routes took off, sending it across Venezuela, sometimes into the interior of Brazil to Europe that way, sometimes across the Guyanese Shield, Guyana, Suriname, going from ports like Paramaribo, Suriname, to Rotterdam in the Netherlands, that way. But over time, Venezuela actually also became a production hub. So you've got laboratories in Venezuela. You've got, again, cocoa growing in Venezuela. And then, of course, without going into detail, important to mention that in Peru, you do have a spreading of cocoa areas under cultivation. It's not just the famous Mantari, Apurimac, and any river valley, the famous Vrime, but you also now have in the jungle regions in places like Ucali, near Pucallpa, cocoa growing there. You have cocoa growing in the border near Colombia, near the Putumayo River. You have it in the south near Bolivia. In Bolivia itself, in places like Chapar. And a lot of that is going basically down through Argentina, Uruguay to Europe, or across through Brazil to Europe. So the bottom line is you have a lot of different cocaine routes with a lot of cocaine from different countries going to different places. And so, yes, you're right. If you're wanting to holistically go after cocaine, there's a lot of countries and a lot of routes you have to deal with. Even if you're going after the U.S.-bound cocaine, it's important to look at both the Pacific routes, coming out of Colombia, going in some cases from Colombia down through Ecuador up to the United States, landing in Mexico sometimes, landing in Guatemala sometimes. Looking at the other routes that go through Venezuela, up through the island chains, up through the Bahamas, to get to the United States that way. So lots of different routes, lots of different countries beyond just Venezuela. But I think it's fair to say that the Cartel de Soles has been one major actor in what is a multi-nation, multi-route problem, and certainly Colombia is really at the heart of.
If you were in charge, how would you stop that?
Well, if the question is how do you stop overdose deaths versus how do you stop cocaine, and like anything else, it has to be a multi prong strategy. And it's not just, okay, you do a little bit of everything, but you have to know what you're going to focus on at different points in time and how. So number one, obviously, it is important to have a certain focus on demand reduction, both in the United States and also in Europe, because, again, a significant portion, actually more demand is coming from Europe right now than from the United States. And so in all those countries, you need demand reduction. Number two, you need expanded interdiction. And so even if you're not sinking drug boats, it was long said that Southcom could only intercept something like, 15% or so of all the things even that it could detect. And so it's not that hard to put sensors, aircraft, intercept boats and things, so that you can, stop those transits. That was something that Joint Interagency Task Force South, JADF South, did back after the old, 1980s Miami Vice cocaine days, and actually pretty effective. And so interdiction, yes, absolutely is one part of the solution. It's not that expensive to do more there. You need more intelligence collaboration. So in part it is, you have these groups. Right now you have the Mexican groups, Sinaloa, Jalisco Nueva Generación, working with different Colombian groups, working now with European groups. And so Italy's Ndrangheta, the Italian Mafia, the Comoro clan, the Albanians are involved in this now. There's lots of different groups. And so Europe, U.S., Latin America, different countries, you have to have that intel collaboration. You also, frankly, have to have territorial control, and with that territorial control, you have to have, eradication. Although there are certain health risks with glyphosate, in my mind, you can't just do manual eradication. You have to do spraying. If you can find safer chemicals, you can find safer chemicals. Although I think glyphosate has gotten a bit of a bad rap, but that was key for Colombia, getting its cocaine production back in the bad old days down from what used to be about 200,000 hectares down to the 40,000 before it fell apart in recent years. Another big piece is you have to go after the money. So the core of these groups doing everything they do, where do they get the boats from? Where do they get the guns? Where do they get the capacity to, bribe all of these officials? Where do you hire people? How do you get the technology that you need? How do you pay for shipments and drug laboratories? At the end of the day, if you can't get and launder your money, everything else begins to fall apart. So the work with Treasury OFAC, the financial crimes unit, the work with what are called financial intelligence units and associated police organizations throughout the Americas is overseen by the Edgemont Group and other organizations. So all of those, you need to be able to get it right. You need to have the financial intelligence, the investigations, the laws, and the books, including not just by banks, but by other types of transactions that are often used to launder money informally. Frankly, two emerging areas of the threat. Number one is a lot of the way in which money is laundered through Chinese activities and Chinese banks. That's hard because a lot of our Latin American law enforcement personnel don't have good technical contacts in China to go after that. And of course, the same problem with that other class of drugs that has a lot of overdose deaths, which is the synthetics. And so fentanyl is only one of the synthetics, but again, a lot of those categories of precursors for fentanyl, of course, come from China. And China kind of helps us on it, but what you really need is aggressive working. You identify, okay, this is a new class of precursor that's being used now. Okay, we need to act aggressively, share intelligence, ban this category, figure out, who the chemical companies are that are exporting, go after those chemical companies. So the problem is that China kind of pretends to cooperate, but they really don't as aggressively as they could, and certainly not with the Mexican government, and only to a limited extent with us. And so you need that. And there are other areas that are emerging areas, such as cryptocurrency. So, a lot of this is now being paid for in crypto. There are ways, depending on the type of crypto resource, to go after that. But again, it's an area where there's limited amount of knowledge, limited amount of capability, and that's making it easier, not harder, to launder funds. So at the end of the day, demand, interdiction, going after production, going after the companies, going after the money, and basically trying to close some of the emerging loopholes. And oh, by the way, there are other areas like making sure that actual law enforcement in the region is functional in terms of technical investigative capabilities, prosecutorial abilities, control of prisons, so that basically, but that's getting into a whole other category of crime. But the other thing that's probably important to say is, even though we focus a lot on the cocaine and fentanyl, right now in the region, two other major sources of revenues. One is, of course, human trafficking, and of course, with migration, especially with Venezuelans, that's a big problem in the extortion of immigration. And another enormous problem is illegal mining, with gold now at over $4,000 an ounce. In illegal mining in places like Peru or the interior of Guyana and Suriname, the Orinoco Belt in Venezuela has actually become more lucrative than drugs. So going after those illegal mining communities to basically take down the criminal organization that live on multiple different illicit sources of revenue. And so, again, lots of things to do if one is king for a day, but it's certainly not a simple one-shot solution. But you have to do all of those things intelligently and collaboratively, in my opinion, to be able to begin to get some positive traction on this.
With the aspect of money probably being the biggest, you said illegal mining, as in like these cartels are going and mining as if they were like, real mining company, or is it illegal mining by the government that they're selling on their own?
Well, essentially what happens, and there's a difference between what they call irregular mining, or informal mining, where instead of having a big mining concession owned by a big country with regulation and oversight, you essentially have certain areas where smallholders are allowed to kind of come in and get what they can. But even within that, there's the question of activities where you have informal mining that's being done in a essentially illegal way without permits, oftentimes using mercury, which leaches into the soil. And so when you look at illegal mining as an activity within the kind of the broader subset of irregular mining, you find entire basically illicit value chains. Because first of all, who buys the gold? Where do they get the cash to buy the gold from? Well, a lot of that cash actually comes from other illicit proceeds. And so one of the ways to launder money from cocaine or other things that you do is actually to take that bulk cash and use that bulk cash to pay for gold. But there's a whole supply chain, and so it's the people that come in to actually work the illegal mines. It's who brings in the equipment, but it's also there are communities that provide goods for the miners and in local informal stores. So who brings illegally, usually who smuggles in things like mercury and other chemicals, which are usually controlled to avoid exactly this from happening. And of course also in those mining communities you usually have lots of other illicit activities, and so widely known for prostitution, other types of essentially human exploitation, and so all of these activities that are generating money and are being used to launder the money from others. And then eventually, typically what happens is you have somebody who operates at the local level, referred to as a consolidator, who basically purchases the gold. Oftentimes you have to launder the gold someplace else because there are registries of, well, where did this gold come from? So for example, Bolivia is a lot less controlled than Peru is. And so oftentimes the illegal mining in Peru, the gold will be essentially smuggled across the border into Bolivia. Then they will get somebody to essentially certify that it came out of a Bolivian mine. So on paper you have these amazingly productive Bolivian mines, which in reality aren't producing anything. But so you've got to launder the gold, you get the gold to market. Who's actually buying the gold? No questions asked if it has the right paperwork. China is a huge importer of gold from the Americas, and so that's another issue. And so it's part of this interconnected criminal economy because, for example, we don't talk about illegal forestry activities a lot, but for example, a lot of the illegal logging that occurs in the interior of Peru, which is a big business, or that occurs in the interior of Brazil. Oftentimes, those logging trucks and logging activities are used also to smuggle in precursor chemicals for laboratories, because sometimes in the same places that you have forests that you're cutting down, you also have clandestine laboratories. In some cases, you also have illegal flora and fauna. The Chinese are very involved in this, and so butterflies, jaguar teeth, you name it. Porpoise bladders in the case of Mexico in the Sea of Cortez. So again, all of these industries tend to support each other. And so we can really talk about a criminal economy with a multiplicity of different players that make money in different ways. So I'll stop at that point, but hopefully just to kind of give viewers an understanding of the complexity of the problem, and the flows of cocaine to the United States really are only the tip of the iceberg of this vast criminal economy that corrupts governments and undermines democracy and is associated with violence as groups compete over territory and other things.
So, as you said that, so you just gave a great overview of all these criminal things, and these cartels are not just in drugs. It sounds like they've diversified their criminal empire to, you said, logging as well, which is essentially going and cutting down trees and selling that, correct?
Absolutely. So, again, so if you look at some of the names that we use, there's a real continuum. So, again, Cartel de los Soles really refers to what's really a criminal franchise, where under Hugo Chavez and then under Nicolas Maduro, essentially the generals and others who controlled territory in Venezuela took a cut from all the illegal operations that were going on in their territory, in the Zodis and Redis. From the extortion, from the gasoline smuggling schemes, from the cocaine laboratories, from the mining, and so it all flowed upwards to the top. So it wasn't so much a master plan as it was a franchise. But within Venezuela itself, you had, for example, different prison gangs. And so the most famous now is Tren de Aragua. They became famous because as you had more and more Venezuelans flowing out, basically they would essentially finance some of those needy Venezuelans. Because if you don't have any money, if you're not one of the lucky in the middle class, how do you get to the United States? How do you pay your passage through Darien Gap in Panama, or however else you're coming? And so a lot of times the deal was, okay, we'll pay your way, but you have to work this off through prostitution or debt service or some other type of thing. And so essentially they set themselves up as basically human trafficking hubs in the cities where they established themselves with these Venezuelans. Originally in places like Bogota, Colombia, or Medellin, and then Lima, Peru, and then with all the Venezuelans coming to the United States, they set themselves up there. And again, assassinating, doing horrible things against other groups who had previously had controlled the territory of things like prostitution. And so, but again, a different group also operating in Venezuela. Also operating in Venezuela, you have the terrorist group, the National Liberation Army, the ELN, that really started out as an organization on the left, essentially trying to overthrow the Colombian government, but over the years operated increasingly in Venezuela, got involved in illegal mining. The Hugo Chavez government and then Nicolas Maduro basically encouraged the ELN to operate on that territory, in part because they were considered more ideologically reliable and disciplined than the other essentially more non-ideological groups. They call them the syndicates or the sindicatos. And so they were brought in. So they kind of used their militarization to displace and control the illegal mining, especially in the Orinoco belt. And so probably a portion of those illegal mining activities that are being run by the ELN, again, a terrorist group, but is doing illegal mining to raise money, and that were being run by the sindicatos, a portion of that within the umbrella of Cartel de los Soles, that funds the ELN. And part of that ELN money goes to Colombia. Or, for example, you have the question of the drug routes. So you have a group like, Ndrangheta, the famous Italian mafia, who, again, puts up the money and facilitates the flows out of a place like Colombia through Venezuela. And oftentimes you'll have a Mexican group who operates locally, Sinaloa. So Sinaloa, on the one hand, is involved in different global operations. Of course, one is the fentanyl trade, mostly with pill presses in Sinaloa State, using Chinese petrochemicals, or I'm sorry, Chinese precursor chemicals, and then in Mexican laboratories, and then smuggling that into the United States. But Sinaloa is also involved in cocaine. So Sinaloa will operate with Colombian groups to get Colombian cocaine through Venezuela to Europe. So again, and that's the same Sinaloa that also has Chinese connections that basically imports Chinese precursor chemicals for their pill presses in Sinaloa to distribute in the United States to Mexican-affiliated gangs like the Aztecs. So there's and then you get into the world of, well, who is laundering all this money? Who is doing the micro-smuggling through individual places in Central America? So really what you have is this vast drug and criminal economy with different people collaborating because there's money in it, collaborating sometimes for political reasons, and it's global. And so Venezuela is one piece, and it touches, but it's important because Venezuela has really become a refuge for all of these different criminal groups that operate globally, a place that they don't have to worry about being extradited and other things, where they can produce, where they can store, where they can generate money from. And so in many ways, it's not just the cocaine that comes out of Venezuela. In many ways, Cartel de los Soles is, and this is probably not quite the way it's characterized by the Trump administration, but it really is kind of a enabler of a vast array of different global criminal activities that are tied to a lot of other bad things happening in a lot of other bad places, if you will.
So do you think that is why Trump has, I guess, targeted Venezuela and announced that CIA is there and they're going to conduct a regime change if possible?
It's a great question. And so the question of why, and again, I go back to, first the why and then the what. The why, to me, is an intersection between the imperative to get drugs under control because that was a big deal in the election for the MAGA base, and really the focus of the Trump administration is to stop what he and his colleagues believe are essentially bad things coming into the United States from our near abroad. And number two, again, Maduro, as we talked about before, is this kind of multidimensional threat, a thorn in his side on crime, on immigration, on China, on Russia, on Iran, and especially people who are more ideological, I think, such as Secretary of State Rubio, are really kind of aligned with that. Okay, well, we really need to do something about Venezuela, not just because of the drugs, but if you want to focus on the drug piece, that's good. We all agree what we need to focus on. Now, the question is, well, why are we doing things this way? And this is just my academic reading, but on the one hand, I think it's consistent with the way President Trump negotiates in general. I mean, going back to his New York real estate days, he's always liked to do something dramatic, sometimes shake things up, whether it's through a threat or some other outlandish thing, and then negotiate from there. And sometimes follows through on the threats, but really prefers not to if he can avoid it, especially if somebody else is willing to do his dirty work for him. So, you saw this with, threatening Greenland, threatening U.S. military action in Panama, increasing tariffs to almost 150% on China, and then backing away from that. So this is a pretty common pattern. And so to say, okay, we're going to get everyone's attention by deploying an amphibious ready group and F-35s and other things to the region and start blowing up drug boats. Yeah, there's a kind of legitimate operational reason for that, but it's also consistent with, okay, let's get lots of attention to put a stop to these flows. And of course, on the Venezuelan side, when it's clear that you have more than enough force to be able to take down Venezuela's entire military infrastructure pretty rapidly, and essentially go in and grab all the leadership targets, maybe some of you get out dead and not alive, but even if it's not enough to occupy a country the size of Venezuela. Just being there in Caracas. The problem during the first Trump administration was that not enough people, as long as the Cubans were watching things from their position of penetration in Venezuela, as long as Venezuelan military counterintelligence the DCIM was watching things as long as Sabine, their other intelligence service, was watching things. It was really hard for the military to move against Maduro, and especially when the military officers themselves knew, okay, yeah, we've been taking a cut of this corruption. We maybe accuse ourselves of human rights violations. There have been United Nations cases. There's been OAS cases, credible, and in investigations that seem to be having evidence. And so, understanding that, okay, yeah, we might not think Maduro is a great guy. We might not even think he's legitimate, but it's kind of like a bank robbery gone bad. If we military leadership move against him, the Cubans and Sabine and DCIM are going to find us out and bad things will happen. But number two, we really don't want to return to a legitimate democratic government because at the end of the day we will be held accountable for all the bad things that we've done. So the Venezuelans have. So the only way that situation gets unstuck, and there were lots of attempts to get it unstuck during the first Trump administration, and just about everyone failed or got exposed. Probably the one that almost succeeded was involved their former intelligence chief. This was back in 2020, Christoph Figuera. But again, the Cubans had that operation penetrated, and that fell apart as well. But at the end of the day now, if the Venezuelans believe that U.S. action is imminent and it will be successful, now, as much as you might be worried, as much as you might not want return to democratic accountability, you think, well, if Maduro is going to lose power, best for me to jump ship and say, hey, I was always with the Democrats all along and I want to save my skin and cooperate with you rather than be stuck on the wrong side and either get killed or later arrested. And so the key thing is if you can accumulate enough force and demonstrate with the drug strikes, with the talk of the CIA. So to me, Trump letting that slip out about the CIA, it's like, okay, for me academically, it's impossible for me to imagine that the CIA has not been operating in Venezuela for who knows how long. And certainly if there are going to be different groups that support democracy, they're going to be talking with somebody. So probably the CIA, if not somebody else, saying, okay, well, how are you going to deliver Maduro? How are we going to get you the money? How are we going to get you out of Venezuela? And your family, et cetera. You've got to have somebody to have those conversations. So at the end of the day, for Trump to say, okay, look, we're going after drug boats. Maybe we're going after land targets. We've got this enormous force that can overwhelm you in a matter of hours. The CIA is in the country. No great surprise. And so all of those things feed that narrative of, and really it's a completely credible narrative. U.S. action is really it's imminent and it's going to be successful. So you better cut the best deal that you can while you can. Now, even though that's a logic, at the end of the day, that still might not get you to those Venezuelans taking matters into their own hands. And so if they don't, then would the U.S. have to execute an operation? I would say yes. And so my sense of what is likely to happen, even though President Trump himself said, okay, we're not thinking about land strikes, is probably the next step would be limited land strikes. So maybe you'll see something against a military port facility or a military air base that is identified as having been used for drug shipments, or maybe even against drug labs, or even against military leadership targets, somebody who is considered a major drug capo, and that would be announced. And so the lesson is, okay, if they're going after this Venezuelan general, then they could just as easily come after Maduro in the bunker that you're sitting there with him. So I think you could see kind of that kind of next stepping up things, maybe with some special forces operations on the ground to grab some people, just to kind of show we can. And I think, but I think at the end of the day, if we had to pull the trigger because Venezuelans didn't take things into their own hands, probably what it would look like is, number one, you would have a massive strike probably within a couple hours to take down the air defenses, take out the S-300 big air defenses that threaten the fighters and other things that we would want to send in. Take out the command and control nodes, probably take out most of the Sukhoi 30s that they've dispersed around the country. Probably take out a few other leadership targets, and then probably after that you would have freedom. Now that the Gerald Ford with its carrier air wing is there on station, you can start bringing over the F-18s to do strikes with the Venezuelan defenses down. You can then operate with almost impunity with the amphibious, with the LHA and the two LHDs, essentially sending Marines in against multiple targets, and so that kind of follow an operation, which probably would come within hours of the first debilitating attack, would probably be what would be essentially grabbing those leadership targets. And I'd have to think that the arrangements of, okay, we need you to secure Maduro, keep him alive for 3 hours until we can, get in and take him off your hands. And so I think you'd probably see that type of thing. Now, then you get to the question of phase 3, because everyone says, okay, well, this would be horrible, and there would be this resistance, and to me, that's things that are said by people that don't know how military planning works, because the U.S. operation would be in and out so quickly that there would not be any resistance. There would be, there might be some people with Eagle S's that were well positioned, some of the few that were actually trained that could get off a lucky shot. We could lose a couple of helicopters, but I think at the end of the day, you're not going to have kind of a U.S. visible occupation that the Maduristas can rally against. But what you could have is that, once you take away the leadership, the natural point for Venezuelans will be to go to the legitimately elected government of Edmundo Gonzalez. So you probably have a lot of generals saying, "Hey, yeah, we were always with you all along. If oh, by the way, as long as you pardon all the things that I've done, et cetera, et cetera." And so you're basically going to have a lot of cynical generals who are going to be putting down the colleagues who didn't make deals. And so in that mess, with others like the Russians and the Cubans trying to actually encourage violence, maybe sabotaging refineries and things like that to try to destabilize the government, a deliberate policy that the Venezuelans themselves call anarchism. But in that, it's entirely plausible for me that the legitimate, now installed democratic government of Edmundo Gonzalez would say to the U.S., hey, we've still got these Cartel de los Soles targets that are still causing these problems in Venezuela. We, the legitimate government, are asking you, the U.S., can you come in and can you strike these targets? Maybe with special operations forces, maybe with airstrikes, maybe with other things. And so there could be a continued post-transition campaign, but it wouldn't be boots on the ground. The boots on the ground would be the legitimate elected government that was elected by a literally more than 2/3 majority July 28th, 2024. So to me, that's where I see this going militarily. That's not a guarantee. I don't think the president has decided that he's willing to take the risk, but if he does pull the trigger, that's kind of some of the phases that I think logically could play out in this.
If all those phases are successful, what is the potential domino effect in the region? Do other countries that are run or corrupted by the drug trade also will fall, or will it unite them all together against the U.S.?
Good question. I think a little bit of both. So number one, I think important to note that Venezuela's traditional allies are pretty much doing nothing. So China's trying to take advantage of this diplomatically, but China hasn't contributed any forces. It's actually going to be sending in, I think at the end of November, it has a hospital ship that's going to be coming through the Caribbean after a stop in Nicaragua, and they're probably just going to be trying to gather electronic intelligence on the U.S. forces and kind of win points by them having a hospital ship while we're doing military operations there. Russia, again, they sent one Ilyushin 76, one plane load full of air defense equipment. Probably the Buk missiles and maybe the Pechora missile system that the Panzer S-1. But and of course Iran has done almost nothing in the military domain. I think certainly Lula in Brazil will be the one trying to rally in the BRICS and multilaterally against U.S. perceived bullying. Certainly Gustavo Petro will scream about this, although, again, I think you're probably going to see a significant political change in Colombia in the elections that they're having next April. There is enormous dissatisfaction in Colombia with Petro. And it's interesting if you look at the region more widely, Venezuela's neighbors that are friends of the U.S., and so the Kamala government in Trinidad and Tobago has been very supportive. Guyana has been cautiously supportive because Venezuela has been threatening their control of the Essequibo region for a number of years now. So I don't think you're going to see much opposition there. You'll probably see in traditional Caribbean politics kind of a rallying, but really without much real action. I think Cuba is going to find itself in a very difficult place. Diaz-Canal, the power grid is falling apart. The economy, ever since COVID, has been just accelerating its collapse. The big thing, of course, after Venezuela changes over is there's going to be nobody to send oil to Cuba anymore. And so that's going to create even bigger problems for the Diaz-Canal regime. So I suspect that they're going to be working against the U.S. as always, but they're going to be in an even more weakened state. The countries like Dominican Republic with the Abinader government, they again, I think they've been very, very strong supporters of the United States. If you look at the region more broadly, it's actually interesting that although there has been a certain amount of expression of concern, we are actually in a period where there has never been so many. Despite everything that one says about the U.S. style and Trump bullying and things like that, if you actually look at for internal political reasons in the region, we have, in my 30 years of following these issues, I can't think of a time when we've ever had such a U.S. friendly region. So you look at South America, with the exception of Brazil, and Yolanda Orsi in Uruguay is trying to kind of keep a low profile. He's kind of center-left with Frente Amplio there. But Argentina, again, very solidly in the U.S. camp, strongly backed by President Trump. Paraguay, with the Colorados and with the Peña government, very, again, solidly working with the U.S. on business and other issues. Daniel Noboa in Ecuador, very closely cooperating on security. Now the new Rodrigo Paz government in Bolivia, reopening to the United States and the IMF and the Corporación de Fomento, the Andean Finance Corporation, and others for the first time. But again, so I think you're going to see limited pushback there. Very likely that in the second round of Chile's elections, the first round is taking place, of course, this Sunday, the second round in December, that the right candidate, Jose Antonio Cast, who has been very anti-Maduro and very pro-U.S., will probably win there. Peru remains to be seen what happens to the Jose Hirri government. Peru is going to have its own elections in which, because of insecurity, the right there could. So I know I'm going through a lot of detail, but it's fascinating because you think about, the anti-U.S. voices that you hear from some quarters and that you think perhaps would logically be there. When you actually look at the politics of the region, you say, wow, we have never had a region that has been this U.S. friendly. And even in Central America, just to mention a few. Panama, despite the problems, the Molino government is very receptive to working with the U.S. and has been expanding relations in the with the jungle warfare school and other things and the Panamax activities. The Honduran government, pretty good chance that one of the two opposition parties will win in the end of the November elections there. If you look certainly at Costa Rica, Rodrigo Chavez, again, very, very pro-U.S., has cooperated with us on a number of different things, has been very supportive on Venezuela. Guatemala, even the center-left Arevalo regime was essentially protected in its position in power by the U.S. and has been actually, very cooperative with the Trump regime. And you can say, well, Claudia Sheinbaum ideologically is probably far to the left and would prefer not to cooperate with the United States, but at the end of the day, almost 90% of Mexican exports go to the United States. A lot of U.S. investment in Mexico. The USMCA free trade agreement is up for negotiation right now, which is really the item critical to Mexico's future survival. And so if you look across the region in its totality, you only find a very small number. I think, and of those small number, certainly Nicaragua with the Daniel Ortega's health now in some serious question. But you see this prospect that that there are a small number of countries that will probably be feeling pretty nervous. There are a lot of other countries that, as much as they might continue to work with the Chinese, and some quarters will protest. But I think by and large, the region is probably going to continue in a pretty U.S. tolerant or U.S. receptive direction. Now, does that mean that they will not be happy, that they will secretly be uncomfortable about some of these things, that they'll raise questions about the legality? I would say yes. But my sense is you'll see a few authoritarian holdouts under a lot of pressure, and the vast majority of the rest of the region will really continue to work with the U.S., even if certain quarters are profoundly uncomfortable with the way that we're doing things.
You mentioned oil, and I just wanted to circle back there. Like, Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the world, supposedly. How much of this do you think is about gaining those oil reserves or gaining access to those oil reserves? I mean, U.S. has launched wars in the past for something else and then actually turned out to be for oil. Do you think this is another occurrence like that? If you had to guess.
No, no, absolutely. And having lived through graduate school myself, to get my doctorate in political science, I'm familiar with it's all about the oil, it's all about the resources, evil capitalism, and I've never thought that was a satisfactory explanation, then, and I really don't hear. Is it likely that part of the prize would be oil? Absolutely. Chevron has operations in big interests, and they have a really powerful lobby in Washington D.C. Oil traders that play golf with President Trump in Mar-a-Lago. Certainly, I think would be very interested. Others, one could even certainly Shell and Total on the European side. Of course, Venezuela has a lot of mining resources, so gold, other minerals, even possibly some rare earths that could be of interest. And so I think getting access and good deals for U.S. and other Western companies to all those things would be part of the prize. Just in the same way that if you have regime change, not to be too cynical about it, but it's hard not to imagine us seeing in the next couple of years a really nice Trump hotel in the middle of downtown Caracas, maybe where the Takandama used to be, or still is. But does that mean that it's all about putting a Trump golf resort in Caracas? No, but is that part of the spoils of a successfully getting Maduro out? I would say absolutely yes. I mean, to me, the core objective here is putting an end to a regime that's been a thorn in the side of President Trump and for two administrations, and has been a strategic threat in so many different areas, and has really been a key contributor to essentially harms that are coming to the United States that directly impact President Trump's core base in places like Ohio, where I grew up, and in Michigan and Pennsylvania. Would we try to get good investment deals out of it afterwards, and would that probably include oil? Absolutely. Is oil the single thing that people want to do all this for? I would say 100% not. But yeah, Venezuela does have a lot of oil, and there would be companies that would want it, and that would probably be one of the core ways of financing the recovery and the reintegration of the company or of the country.
How much of this, because it's not an invasion, but it's also not like Korea, how much of this is internet violating international law?
Great question. So I'm not an international lawyer. Like I said, I will, as an analyst, I will tell you it certainly gives a lot of people the strong appearance of violation of international law, whether it's, the use of violence, whether it's a question of, are we actually in a war or not? Does that mean we have to have the invocation of, that's domestic law, the invocation of the War Powers Act, et cetera, et cetera. So I think certainly there are serious questions that are being raised by serious people, including allies of the United States, about that. Of course, I worry more about the strategic consequences than I necessarily expect that there will be any type of decisive answer. Now, it's not impossible to imagine that later some who have actually called for investigations, in the International Court of Human Rights or other, international jurisdiction, that, could we actually see some of those things pursued against the United States? Depends probably what a future administration was willing to do or not block. But I think probably in an analysis of international relations, I'm not sure the questions of morality or legality probably don't get us anywhere useful, but understanding how the perceptions of those things impact the willingness of our partners to work with us and could impact essentially future U.S. soft power and our future ability to differentiate ourselves from countries who have clearly been seen as aggressors in their areas of the world, China, Russia, Iran. I frankly, my personal view is that this way of doing things, we are not doing ourselves any favors. We are strategically shooting ourselves in the foot in a number of different levels, and I think we will likely, and for something that is marginally effective in the short term, we will probably be paying the strategic consequences of this for many years to come.
So would one of the consequences you were thinking of being like the U.S. image of it being a bully coming in and trying to force its will against another country, or what other consequences were you thinking?
Sure, yeah. So again, multiple different levels. So yeah, so number one is what I would call the differentiation. So, back in the days of the Soviet Union, I grew up in the Cold War. You could say, well, the U.S., people would criticize us, but, we're the good guys. We have democracy. We advocate for human rights. We used to rally against everything the Soviet Union did with the famous gulags in Siberia with respect to the suppression of rights in Eastern Europe, things like that. And today we, I think, rightfully call out the Chinese for their suppression of their people, for the suppression of freedom of information, for their internment of Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang, for essentially, crushing democratic resistance in Hong Kong, for intimidating Taiwan, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, rightfully also, Russia, the horrific things that Vladimir Putin has done in the Ukraine and his broader threats against Europe. So, to the degree to which, countries say, heck, China has lots of money, China is should we not do business with with China and do business with the United States? Because effectively, China's the bad guys and they're sneaky and they're coercive, and the United States uses rule of law. So, to the degree to which the perception of the United States is, oh, well, China's aggressive, the United States is aggressive, China takes law into its own hands, and so does the United States. China suppresses freedom of speech, the Trump administration suppresses freedom of speech. And so, China's corrupt, but the U.S. has declared that it's not enforcing its Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. And so the differentiation effect is when we become so transactional and we do things that essentially take away the essentially moral advantage. It's like then you put us into a realm of saying, well, who can give us personally more money, given that all of the people that we deal with have things that can be criticized. And so, in many ways, what I see it is we are taking away a key differentiator in the court of public opinion of why people want to work with us and align themselves with us. And so, not necessarily that people will run away from us for that, although certainly I think there is some diversification away from the United States where we are seen as if we are seen as doing things that are, in their perception, illegal or immoral. I think there's a secondary effect where, again, and you see this already with Colombia and others, where people may not want to share intelligence with us, or people may be reluctant to partner with us or trust our commitments in certain legal agreements. People may not want to be dependent in maintaining certain reserves in dollars, especially at a time when the Chinese is actually pushing everyone to denominate contract in renminbi, and so suddenly that doesn't look like such a bad idea. And so there is a kind of pushing countries away from us, pushing countries to rely on others than the United States, countries that now recognize, oh, well, if the U.S. could do this to Venezuela, then maybe we could be vulnerable too. How do we prepare, to avoid our vulnerability. And so I think there's a lot of this, both how you take away your image in great power competition and those advantages, but also how you essentially push other countries to take actions to protect themselves or hedge, or at least not want to enter into beneficial relationships of trust and contracts and defense reliances with you. And so I think that there's a kind of a broad variety of things, all of which in different ways undercut our strategic position and thus ultimately our security and prosperity, in my opinion.
So, on a closing note, is there any message you would like the audience to know overall about the situation, or maybe a specific area we did not touch?
I think I think the important thing is just really kind of understanding the complexity, because right now this is cast as one thing or the other. Recognizing that, at least in my opinion, on the one hand, the legitimate democratic government of Venezuela is indeed Edmundo Gonzalez, again, very proven. And so something that restores the democratically elected government, although possibly through questionable routes, isn't entirely a bad thing. Cartel de los Soles, is enormous criminal franchise that's doing damage across the region. Maybe you could say, well, Maduro isn't a hierarchical commander of Cartel de los Soles, so you can quip about what it is, or whether it's cocaine versus fentanyl, and how many overdose deaths. But I think at the end of the day, there are issues, there are positives of the prospects for restoration of democracy, legitimate reasons why the U.S. And really the region is a lot better off. Cartel de los Soles under control, why there are important deterrent effects, by these things. And yet at the same time, I would say that since the Second World War, the cement, the foundation of U.S. power and influence has not been just its military, but has been goodwill, faith, and desire of people to align themselves with U.S. democracy, and trust in rule of law and protection of the individual as something, not just because the U.S. says it, but because people believe that is the safest route for them. And so the degree to which we move away from those things, to me, I believe the long-term risk is to, at a critical moment of transition with a rising China, that we undercut the most important strategic assets that we have. And so I see a lot of positive and necessary things coming from the current U.S. trajectory. I have certain fears of how things are going to turn out if there's a decisive military operation that unleashes chaos. But I think most profoundly, the how matters, and the understanding that if we, U.S., behave badly and abandon the core values that are at the source of our soft power to get those results, what we are giving up could be, I worry, a lot larger than what we gain.
Thank you for your time today, and thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on the program.